What's up, guys? Today I wanted to talk about one of the players I believe could be the Bears' biggest breakout candidate heading into 2025 and a narrative that's going around about Jalen Carter. Let's go ahead and get right into it. First off, I want to be clear. I'm in no way, shape, or form hating on Jalen Carter, and I'm not saying that Gervon Dexter is better either, but the narratives here are simply out of control. People are saying Ryan Poles messed up by passing on Jalen Carter. He should be fired for that. But they fail to mention that we got a player who has been arguably as good as Jalen Carter in the second round. And on top of that, we also landed Darnell Wright. And for as much as people complain about Ryan Poles not addressing the offensive line, you can't have it both ways. You can't say he should have taken Jalen Carter when you're also saying he doesn't address the offensive line as much. Because this O line would have given up 100+ sacks this season without Darnell Wright. But here's what I want to talk about: Gervon Dexter and his superstar upside compared to Jalen Carter and what he's done in Philadelphia. In order to understand this, guys, this one requires context. Please watch the entire video and understand what I'm trying to say before trying to argue with me in the comments. The first thing we need to talk about is production, where Gervon Dexter actually had more sacks this year than Jalen Carter did in 200+ less snaps. Think about that for a minute, especially the people who say Carter is a stud and that Dexter sucks. Big Dex had more sacks in 214 less snaps. And I'm not at all taking anything away from Jalen Carter. I'm just trying to point out what Gervon Dexter has done on a less talented defense that was also playing from behind, and he also played less snaps. But when it comes to production, pressures are what defensive linemen are judged most by, and Big Dex has been just as productive on a snap-by-snap basis. This season, Gervon Dexter had 5 sacks, and he produced 1 pressure every 15.7 snaps. Meanwhile, Jalen Carter had 4.5 sacks and 1 pressure on every 15.6 snaps. But for some reason, there's now a national narrative that Jalen Carter is this all-pro player, and nobody even talks about Gervon Dexter. Why is that? Dex played less snaps this season, but still produced more sacks than Carter did on a less talented defensive line and a losing team. That doesn't make any sense. And then there's also a narrative that the reason why that is because Jalen Carter is double teamed on every snap, and that Big Dex is never double teamed. Again, simply not true. In reality, they're both double teamed around 50% of the time, with Carter averaging somewhere around a 55% double team rate and Gervon Dexter checking in around 45%. So yes, Carter did get slightly more double teams, but he's not double teamed on every play, and the amount of double teams he gets really isn't that much more than what Gervon Dexter gets on a less talented defensive line. One of the reasons this narrative exists is because there was a stat released early in this season where Carter was the most double team player in the NFL, but that evened out over the course of the entire season, and people are still going off a stat that was in week 3 of the season. But the bottom line is this: when it comes to production, Dexter had more sacks, more tackles, and pretty much the exact same snap to pressure ratio, while also grading out higher against the run. But that's just production. I still have to talk about surrounding talent and the Vic Fangio effect. So next up, let's consider the situation a player is in. You have to be fair here. Gervon Dexter played on a 5-win team that was losing most of the games they played this season. Meanwhile, Jalen Carter played on a team that had the lead more than any other team in the NFL, something you simply have to take into context. Not to mention the talent around them on the defensive line, though. Gervon is playing with pretty much Montez Sweat and a bunch of decent players. Meanwhile, the Philadelphia Eagles defensive line is an absolute monster to deal with, featuring 3 first-round picks, Jalen Carter, as well as his former Georgia teammates Nolan Davis and Jordan Smith, but also featuring studs like Josh Sweat, Zach Bond, and Byron Young. It's not even a question. The Eagles defensive line has a lot more talent than the Bears does right now. So if you put Jalen Carter on the Bears and you put Gervon Dexter on the Eagles, how do you think that would change the perception? Also, considering how productive Gervon Dexter was on the Bears, do you think he could have been more productive surrounded by all that talent on the Eagles, playing on a team that had the lead? It's a fair question and something else you have to take into account. Jalen Carter is simply surrounded by talent. Having that much talent on the line opens things up for guys like Josh Sweat, who had 2.5 sacks in the Super Bowl. Montez Sweat is the only first round pick on the Chicago Bears defensive line, and we traded for him. But you simply have to take surrounding talent into account when comparing players. But on top of that, the biggest narrative going around that I continue hearing is that Jalen Carter changed the Eagles' defense. This is simply not true. And look, I love Jalen Carter. I had him ranked as my number one player in the draft in 2023. People who watch this channel will remember. However, we have to give credit where credit is due. And as Bears fans, we know coaching matters, but we've also seen firsthand what the Vic Fangio effect can do for a defense. And the bottom line is this again, the numbers don't lie. The Eagles drafted Jalen Carter in 2023. They finished that season worse on defense than they did in 2022, coming in with the 30th ranked scoring defense. So drafting Jalen Carter did not change the defense. But this year, the defense turned around. What changed this year? They didn't draft Jalen Carter this year, but they did hire Vic Fangio. So the first season after Jalen Carter was drafted, the Eagles had the 31st ranked defense overall, while they were 26th in total yards allowed. They also lost in the first round of the playoffs. This season, though, with Vic Fangio calling the defense, they had the second overall rated defense in the entire NFL, and they were first in yards per game and second in points allowed per game. Now it's with Vic Fangio that all of a sudden the Eagles had one of the best defenses in the entire NFL, the same defense that dominated Patrick Mahomes in the Super Bowl. And that, my friends, is the Fangio effect. But for some reason, the national narrative going around is that it was all Jalen Carter. But listen, if Gervon Dexter was on that exact same defense, he'd be a Pro Bowler right now, and I still think that defense would have been just as good. But the bottom line, though, is that winning matters in the NFL. And right now, the big narrative is that Gervon Dexter isn't very good, mostly because the Bears haven't won games. And I am not among the people who believe that. I think Gervon is one of the best young interior linemen in the NFL, and there's a lot of factors that go into whether or not people determine someone as a success. If we can play more games with the lead next season, win more of those games, and add more talent along the D line, I believe Gervon Dexter is poised for a breakout season and could very well change this narrative in 2025. I still believe that Jalen Carter is an awesome player, but I do think he is slightly overrated due to the effect that Vic Fangio had on that defense and what Saquon Barkley did to the offense. If the Eagles weren't winning games, nobody would be talking about Jalen Carter. But I have one final point to the polls detractors who say, we passed on Jalen Carter and Darnell Wright sucks. Can you guys even imagine how many sacks we would have given up this year without Darnell Wright? A guy who has the potential to be a Pro Bowl tackle heading into year 3. If he reaches that potential this season, would you feel the same way then? And on top of that, we also got a 4th round pick by trading back, and we took Gervon Dexter in the next round. All of that context matters, and I just had to talk about this one because Big Dex is one of my favorite players on this roster, and people are just talking nonsense when it comes to this. I believe that Gervon Dexter and Jalen Carter are both great players, and if Darnell Wright develops into a Pro Bowl player, then we actually got the better of that trade. But I am curious, how do you guys feel about this? What are your thoughts on Gervon Dexter, maybe even Jalen Carter? Let me know in the comments. I have a ton more videos on the way. I will be live with Greg Gabriel tomorrow at noon Central Time. Get your questions ready. We're going to be talking about the off season. Stay tuned. Remember to hit that like button for me. And until next time, bear down.